In the British literary Romantic period, roughly between 1770 and 1835, women poets were expected to write about feminine topics that fall under the category of the domestic, like marriage, motherhood, and the home, and to compose in personal modes like the lyric. In fact, as Stephen Barrett notes, the act of writing was itself a defiance of gender norms for women in the 18th century, as it published, or made public, an otherwise cloistered female voice.
Women poets of the Romantic period comprise a very large and yet less well-known demographic of women writers from this era. Romanticism scholars will most likely be familiar with the work of Felicia Hemans and Charlotte Smith, for example. But these poets do not enjoy the same cultural cachet as women novelists of the period, such as Jane Austen and Mary Shelley, authors of Pride and Prejudice and Frankenstein, respectively. This exhibit of works written by British women poets of the Romantic period, curated for the 20th anniversary of the British Women Writers' Conference, puts their writing on display in two public forums, the Rare Book Room in Norland Library and on CU Library's website. Together, the digital and in-house components of this exhibit work to increase awareness of the poets and their works, and make these books accessible for scholars, teachers, students, and the intellectually curious.
The exhibit progresses, as these poets did in their writing, from the home, out into nature, and farther afield into social destinations and political arenas that were considered the exclusive territory of men. This movement away from the home toward social destinations also reflects the trend in women's travel and political engagements at the time. With the decline of the gentleman's grand tour in the mid-18th century and the rise of picturesque tourism, it became more acceptable and feasible for women to journey throughout Europe, document their impressions, and comment on their role as public citizens.
Women authors wrote prolifically in more feminine genres of verse and letters in order to make inroads into masculine topics related to global politics, commerce, travel, and science. Therefore, this exhibit traces their authorial voices and lives as they venture outward from the home to landmarks in nature and social destinations across Europe.
The Reverend John Francis Stanforth's Catalogue of the Library of Female Authors is the cornerstone of this exhibit. This manuscript tome preserves a record of Stanforth's private library, where he collected over 6,000 books written by British and American women authors, and most with publication dates between 1750 and 1850. There are two editions of this book that remain, this manuscript, owned by CU Libraries, and a print edition that the auctioneers of Stanforth's library published just after his death in 1867. As depicted in his manuscript, Stanforth's collection is a feminist curatorial project. It is a radically inclusive collection of women's writing that features a wide array of authors and nationalities, genres, topics, and publication dates as early as the 17th century. Stanforth's home library therefore critiqued gendered early 19th century ideas about what women should write and publish, what makes a book worthy of collection, and what gentlemen should read and exhibit in their private libraries. Our own Women Poets of the Romantic Period collection strives to accomplish what the Reverend Stanforth's private collection did in the mid-19th century and his catalogue continues to do. Gather and offer access to these works and authors who have shaped print culture and literary history. Stanforth's catalogue documents a vast panoply of women authors during the Romantic era and how their journeys into the public begin in the privacy and domestic space of the home. Here they often play multiple roles, including wife, mother, lover, household manager, and author. The women poets in this exhibit push the boundaries of the domestic to include a range of audiences, including fellow women poets with whom they socialized and connected with as writers. Significant to the promotion of women's poetry, literary annuals were a publishing phenomenon of the 1820s and 1830s. Scholar Catherine Ledbetter explains that they were anthologies of original poetry and prose illustrated with steel plate engravings, specially designed as Christmas and New Year's gifts for middle-class readers.
Mary Cockle's letter to Jane Porter, dated July 22, 1833. Cockle begins this piece with an elegy addressed to Jane Porter's sister, Anna Maria Porter, a contemporary poet who died of typhus fever on 21 September 1832. Cockle's letter was sent to Jane Porter via the Southwark Penny Post nearly 10 months after Anna Maria's death. The elegy is carefully transcribed in large, fairly legible handwriting and comprises most of the body of the letter. After the elegy, Cockle scrawled several lines of personal correspondence to Jane in tiny and nearly indecipherable lettering across the back of the letter. Here, she states that she still awaits a response to her previous letter and will be staying at Southold for the next month to benefit from the sea air. The letter shows a published poet dedicating her craft for very personal use, a contrast to the political working-class poetry of Eliza Cook, for example.
Little Derwent's Breakfast, a children's book published anonymously by Emily Trevenen in 1839, collects poems written to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's 7-year-old grandson. These poems are ideologically crafted to teach the young Derwent how to be a proper British gentleman according to the norms of the late Romantic era. Of course, the setting for these lessons is not a classroom, but instead the breakfast table. Derwent learns, for example, how milk, bread, and cheese derive from farm labor, presumably on his estate, and can provide coarser nourishment or delicacies depending on how they are prepared. Furthermore, he learns about empire and trade through the example of tea, which arrives on his table via a fantasy land called China, a place valuable to British businessmen, as their ivory carvings, their fans, and their toys, where whimsical fancy their genius employs. Their drawings, their colors, their rare Indian ink, their beautiful teacups from which we may drink, are brilliant to look at and pleasant to use. How few would such elegant presents refuse? Besides which, of many more things you may read of this land that supplies us with much that we need.
The theme of interment connects Porter's Gothic ballad to Lady Charlotte Susan Maria Beery's tome entitled The Three Great Sanctuaries of Tuscany, published in 1833. Following the death of her second husband, the Reverend Edward John Beery, the author published this book-length poem and dedicated it to his memory. It is illustrated with scenes originally drawn by her husband and embellished in full-page mezzotint engravings. The dramatic chiaroscuro of the mezzotints, as well as the significant size and weight of this volume, proportioned like a coffee table book, make it possible to interpret this object as a bibliographical monument to the late Reverend Bury's memory. The poem describes 3 Tuscan monastic communities that she visited in 1818 in a mixed genre that is at once a travelogue, homage to the beauty and history of these locations, and blunt social commentary. In her preface, she compares the Italians unfavorably to the Scottish Highlander community that she belongs to, and calls the Italians, quote, "these poor deluded people who drink not at the source of life and glory, as we in our happier mountains." End quote. Moving from the domestic portion of the exhibit to the Gothic is a surprisingly small step. The Gothic case bridges the home and family to natural landmarks by way of terror and the sublime. Jane Taylor's book Rhymes for the Nursery, published in 1837, might have been on little Derwent's bookshelf. However, several of the edifying poems in this petite and tattered volume educate not by explaining the origins of favorite food commodities, but instead by fear. For example, Miss Helen in the poem The Giddy Girl refused to heed her mother's warning to stay away from the well, and consequently slipped on its edge, fell in, and drowned. Similarly, in the poem Playing with Fire, a child learns not to play too near to the blazing hearth through the story of a little girl whose pinafore went up in flames. The moral concludes, "In vain she tried to put it out, till all her clothes were burnt about, and then she suffered 10 times more, all over with the dreadful sore. For many months before 'twas cured, most shocking torments she endured, and even now in passing by her, you see what 'tis to play with fire."
This work, Ballad, Romances, and Other Poems, is written by Anna Maria Porter, the poet about whom Mary Cockle elegized in her letter to Jane Porter. Porter is author of just one collection of poems, and the edition held by CU Library's Special Collections is the first edition, published in 1811. A pirate edition of this collection was published in 1816, and is a testament to Porter's authorial success as both a poet and, perhaps even more so, as a novelist. Anna Barbald, author of the poem 1811, also featured in this exhibit, wrote a review of Porter's collection that praises it as containing much that is elegant and pleasing. The very first poem in this collection is perhaps less elegant than chilling. It is a Gothic ballad romance about an aunt named Edith, who must care for her young nephew named Eugene, the son of her despised deceased sister and her husband, whom Edith desired in vain. The plot follows Edith as she murders the pretty child that reminds her of unrequited love. Immediately following Eugene's funeral rites, Edith gets lost and is mysteriously buried alive in the same labyrinthine vaults in which her victim is interred.
Flora and Talia relates closely to 2 remarkable books in our collection by naturalist poet Sarah Hoare. Hoare's 2 books, a poem on the pleasures and advantages of botanical pursuits, published in 1825, and her poems on conchology and botany, with plates and notes, published in 1831, bespeak her desire to educate mothers in natural history to, in turn, educate their sons. In one preface, the author implores women to teach their sons to, quote, "despise any such despicable amusements as horse racing, hunting, cockfighting, or any kind of exercise that inflicts on useful, unoffending animals the least degree of unnecessary suffering, and often brings on those who encourage such things disgrace and ruin." End quote. Furthermore, both of these books, but especially poems on conchology and botany, demonstrate Hoare's ability to study and publish on a scientific topic, a field that belonged principally to men, by carefully positioning herself as a nurturing teacher of natural history and describing each specimen in decorative verse.
Instead of natural history, Sarah Hamilton writes within the tradition of picturesque travel writing in her collection entitled Sonnets, Tour to Matlock, Recollections of Scotland, and Other Poems by a Resident of Sherwood Forest. This volume, published in 1825, includes a long narrative poem called Tour to Matlock, Dovedale, that tells the story of 4 women who travel together to Derbyshire for leisure. They visit scenic landmarks like caves in Tissington, take a boat down the Derwent River, stroll through museums and churches, and summit a tall peak despite iffy weather. The recount of the journey has a distinctly feminine feel, as the narrator relays such details as the difficulty of keeping one's hair in neat curls when it is rainy and windy. The poem is remarkable for its documentation of how travel practices had changed by the end of the Romantic era in the 1820s. The narrator, for example, mentions the oddity of seeing railway tracks juxtaposed with those traveling by carriage and on foot. Notably, 4 women, unaccompanied by a spouse or chaperone, traveled through cities and countrysides together at their leisure, a practice that would not have been permissible during the earlier 18th century, when gentlemen's grand tour through Europe was the norm.
This exhibit features first editions of 3 of Charlotte Smith's works, Beachy Head, Elegy Sonnets, and The Emigrants. Smith's inventive use of the sonnet form was the most important catalyst for its revival during the Romantic era. Elegiac sonnets grew from a small collection of 16 sonnets in 1784 to a compendium of 92 sonnets. Like the sonnets, Beachy Head investigates place, nature, and the unknown to understand subjectivity formation for the Romantic woman author.
From Bury's pastoral Tuscan scenery, we travel to the natural landmarks portion of the exhibit, where we have a collection of works that range from flower books to picturesque travel narratives. Our favorite flower book in this collection is entitled Flora and Thalia, or Gems of Flowers and Poetry. This book, published in 1835, fits an array of contents, authors, and uses into its very small, beautiful binding. In size, it is the antithesis of Lady Bury's 3 great sanctuaries. Entries in the section Flora Alphabetica list the name of a flower for each letter of the alphabet, its botanical description, a hand-painted illustration of the flower, and finally a series of poems about it. Each of these 3 components for a single flower listing, description, illustration, and poetry, are composed by a variety of naturalists, painters, artists, and lithographers, and poets to form an incredible, polyvocal, multi-genre collection. The anonymous female author, or rather, editor, of Flora and Thalia urges the reader to put this book in her pocket, walk out the front door, and, as her small anthology does, go collect botanical specimens. She writes, "One of the advantages of botany is that we must add exercise to study, as we cannot learn it from books sitting in our easy chair by the fireside." Letitia Landon published verse under the initials L.E.L. during the early 19th century. Though her poems often appeared in petite-sized annuals like The Keepsake, here they are collected in a heavy double volume. One of the book's previous owners embraced the spirit of the Florilegium, or anthology, as a gathering of leaves by decoratively pressing flowers on several pages. Their ghostly imprints adorn the text of 4 Gothic poems, including The Wreck.
This rare edition of Miss Frances's poetry contains 2 poems about the comet of 1811. The comet was visible to the naked eye for 17 months. The poem, entitled Comets and Women, a Parallel, is a versification of a newspaper article that appeared in September of 1811, and another poem entitled The Storm King, or The Origin of the Comet, an Extravaganza, is perhaps an imaginative, cosmic revision of the myth of Pan and Syrinx.
Elizabeth Edge is not a Romantic era poet, yet her 1839 Commonplace book contains poetry of the day. Book historian Stephen M. Cockle defines a commonplace book as a self-made anthology or means of collecting favorite reading material. Contents could be as diverse as biblical passages, poetry, literary quotes, artwork, and, in the case of Elizabeth Commonplace book, early embossed Valentine cards. A poem by Felicia Hemans is included. Like Mary Alcock, Eliza Cook, the author of this volume called Malaya and Other Poems, did not shy away from overtly political commentary. In 1848 she published a poem called A Song to the People of England, written in support of political rights for the working class and the Chartist movement. In 1849, Cook's own journal further advocated such social and political transformation. She encouraged educational and career opportunities not only for the working class in general, but also for women, a leveling up as she called it. As she describes in her journal, newly developed modes of travel held promise for an acceleration of the leveling process. The railway and the steamboat, worked and directed by a few gallons of water, have proved the greatest of leveler. Formerly the prince traveled in a chariot with outriders, the noble in a clumsy sort of caravan, the gentleman squire on horseback, the citizen in a stagecoach, and it took a fortnight to pass from Newcastle or Preston to the metropolis. The great mass of the people were confined to their own locality, as a limpet is fixed to a rock. But now the working man may travel 20 miles an hour at the rate of a penny a mile, far outstripping the speed of the royalist traveller of old. He is now carried along in the same train with the prince, the duke, and the member of Parliament. No doubt Cook also considered how faster and more abundant transportation would disseminate her published works as well. Her poems in the volume here, called Malaya, represent a mixture of themes including Chartist political ideals, such as in her poem titled The Free, and less political reflections on nature.
Along with Sarah Hamilton's Tour to Matlock, Mary Alcock's poem The Air Balloon, or Flying Mortal, turns the corner from the natural landmarks part of the exhibit to the final section that takes up the theme of social movements and destinations. This set of book artifacts references the large number of poets in the WPRP collection who wrote works that engaged with social and political movements during the Romantic era, as well as the spaces and places where people gathered. The Air Balloon, a simple paper pamphlet made of old rags and linens, cost 1 shilling when it was published in 1784, the equivalent of 12 cents today. The booklet opens with a satirical advertisement that promises to take away readers who, quote, wishing to become aerial beings, may have too much spirit and ambition to continue a day longer to creep on the earth, end quote. A note at the bottom of the page states that this publication, quote, will be found to be of the greatest importance to those who wish to evade the laws of their king or country. The advertisement's mock rebellion resonates through the ironic tone and fanciful language used throughout the poem. In each stanza, the narrator offers a worldview that is no longer valid after looking down from the vantage of an air balloon basket, and closes with a variation of a line about leaving the gazing, bumbling multitude below. The result is a gritty and satirical critique leveled at those who believe the new invention of the hot air balloon, discovered just a year earlier in 1783, will offer its passengers a truly elevated status and perspective. The playful jabs taken at those who gain perspective on the imagination and on nature from great heights is also a knock against high romantic poets like William Wordsworth, for whom summiting mountains usually led to poetic revelations and reflections on man's relationship with nature. To conclude, Elizabeth Cobbold's volume, called Cliff Valentines, bound together with an ode on the victory of Waterloo, draws together the start and ending of this landmark Women Poets of the Romantic Period exhibit by referencing women's roles as wife, lover, and entertainer in the domestic sphere, her capacity to compose poetry, illustrate, and publish, and her identity as a public citizen affected by European politics and the defeat of the French Empire in the early 19th century. Cliff Valentines contains a collection of poems largely written for the annual Valentine Ball that Cobbold and her husband hosted. At the ball, Elizabeth distributed intricate, handmade Valentine cards to her guests. Quote, ball guests were given them as souvenirs of the evening, those for gentlemen mounted on blue paper and the ladies on rose pink, end quote. The intricate binding, original drawings, and a handwritten dedication on the title page all make this volume an incredibly personal example of Elizabeth's authorship. The content of the book exemplifies the author's interest in botany and her knowledge of fine delicacies. Her tone in the poems within Cliff Valentines is whimsical, charming, and fun, with some poems dedicated to inanimate and natural objects, such as the short poem entitled Pineapple. Harriet Cobbold's illustrated each page with skillful, hand-drawn illustrations to accompany each poem. The artist's precise execution of the drawings is a hallmark of this work. The volume belongs to the social destinations portion of the exhibit, not only for its referral to Valentine's Day assemblies and romance, but also for its surprising inclusion of an ode to Waterloo that ends the volume. Waterloo is perhaps the most well-known historical and geographical landmark of the Romantic period, and this long, unillustrated patriotic ode on Napoleon's defeat seemingly rests in stark contrast to the short and meticulously embroidered Valentine poems that precede it. However, the two volumes bound into one, love poems followed by effusive, versified praise for Britain's bloody victory over the French in 1815, are perhaps less at odds than one might at first suspect. Cobbold's unique book encapsulates the variety and depth of this important collection.